Hello everyone, my name's Karina Alcott and I'm the Executive Director at BIC and your host for this BIC Brunch event today, which is all about digital content in light of the EU Accessibility Act. So thank you for joining us. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Questions will be taken after all the presentations have been given, so please use the questions box in your, there's a little toolkit on the side of your screen, so use the question box in there to submit your question to us at any time, and we won't reveal names or anything like that, so don't be shy. Excuse me. The event is being recorded for BIC to use in its marketing, but also to allow people who weren't able to come today to still enjoy the event later on. So it'll be shared on YouTube in about a month's time. And again, attendees, just to reassure you all, attendees won't be identified in the recording at any time. Please note that while the session will explore the content requirements of the EAA, it shouldn't be considered in any way to be legal advice. None of us are lawyers, so please do bear that in mind. You shouldn't consider it to be legal advice, and neither will we be addressing any business specific questions. There is a poll, just a quick one question poll that will appear when we get to the Q&A session. So that's just about one question about your EAA readiness. And again, all responses will be anonymous. No one will be able to identify you. All that will happen is we'll be able to see the results as they come in terms of numbers of people that have replied. So no names will be shared. And of course, you don't have to answer it. There's no obligation on you to answer that if you prefer not to. And finally, a gentle reminder that BIC is a neutral members organisation, and as such, we politely ask that all attendees and all speakers avoid any conversations or questions that might be considered commercially sensitive or anti-competitive. We'll be sharing slides later on, so if you see links that you want to make note of, don't panic. You'll be getting a copy of the slides later on, likely next week. So here's a quick run through of the schedule for today. So our first speaker today will be Simon Mellins, and Simon is an independent digital publishing consultant and accessibility specialist. Plus he's a co-founder and working group member of the Publishers Accessibility Action Group, or PAGE as it's more commonly known. He'll be followed by James Janczak, Production Technologies Manager at Taylor & Francis. And finally, we will have Paul Porter, Technology Officer at RNIB. As I've already said, there'll be a Q&A session and we should be finished by about 1:30. So before we get started, BIC, who are we? For the benefit of those of you who aren't yet familiar with us, BIC is a UK-based members organisation that sits at the heart of the book industry, creating standards, best practices and resources. We help organisations become more efficient, save money, become less wasteful and ultimately greener. We hold a unique position of trust, facilitating UK and international industry-wide collaboration to reach agreement on dependable standards and best practice in the supply chain. We do this in a variety of ways, including running 5 strategic committees focusing on libraries, metadata, physical, digital, and green supply chains. We offer training events and workshops and execute supply chain related projects for and on behalf of our membership, but also the wider book industry. We also operate 3 industry recognised accreditation schemes, but you can find out more about everything we do on our website via the link on the screen. So just a bit about this series. So today's session is the 3rd one in BIC's brand new series of webinars dedicated to accessibility, currently running from now, well, from earlier than now, until April next year, and very possibly beyond. Today, our 3 expert speakers will guide us through the accessibility requirements of the content of a digital book, and we will look at ePubs and briefly PDFs and hear what it means for an ebook to be truly accessible, what is required by the EAA, the common pitfalls to avoid and what we can be doing better. Amongst many other things, we'll learn about design requirements, what to consider when working with vendors, and we'll also hear firsthand about the impact of accessible content on readers with accessibility requirements. So, without further ado then, I would like to hand over to Simon. First of our speakers, Simon Mellins, please come to the virtual stage. As I've already said, Simon is an independent digital publishing consultant with over 8 years experience in the accessibility space. He's also a co-founder and working group member of Page, and he's going to talk to us today about what we mean by accessible content. He'll give us a summary of the overarching core principles of WCAG and talk about accessibility design principles, working with vendors, assistive technologies, and much more. So I'm going to now attempt to hand over the screen to Simon, so please do bear with me while we do that. So over to you, Simon. Hopefully that worked.
Excellent. Yes, I did. Thank you, Karina.
Brilliant.
Okay, I'm going to assume everybody can see my slides at this point.
Yes.
And say hello. And thank you for joining me for my little talk here. This section is called Too Many Cooks, Key Ingredients to Accessible Publishing. So this is going to have a content focus, but we'll always keep one eye on how to make that content happen in a kind of real life production process. We're going to begin by talking about why now? What's the sudden urgency? And as hopefully everybody watching this knows, the European Accessibility Act enforcement deadline is 28th of June 2025. And the European Accessibility Act has got us all up in a flurry because of its vague language. It mentions ebooks, not just ePub, which means it covers everything, the content as well as the platform. So there'll be things that we'll talk about today that you can interfere with, that you can improve, and things that you can't. It depends if you're running a publisher or indeed a reading platform. The penalties for the European Accessibility Act for non-compliance are generally per title or per infringement, and they are huge. In Germany, it's up to 100,000 euros. Ireland, 60,000 plus potentially 18 months in prison. And France, 7,500 euros, plus a referral to the public prosecutor. There are lots of other examples of these in different EU states, and similar legislation is arriving around the world. So, for example, there are different countries in Africa, North and Latin America, East and South Asia, and the Middle East. So, who am I to talk to you about all of this? Well, as Karina said, I'm a digital publishing and accessibility consultant. I have over 15 years experience in digital publishing, having specialized in accessibility for the last 8 of those. I work across magazine, STEM, trade, illustrated, and educational over the years. I bring a practical and strategic focus, as well as being the co-founder of the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, member of Book Machine's editorial board, and I host the Digital Publishing Podcast. Hopefully we've got some listeners in the audience today. I've worked with organizations of all different scales, and that also includes both publishers and technology providers and vendors. But I'm not a lawyer. So just to follow on from Karina's warning before, same goes for me, not a lawyer, none of this is legal advice, and it is incredibly important that you speak to whoever your formal legal advice actually comes from to get them to sign off or indeed not sign off on your plans and make sure that you're in agreement as an organization. A lot of what we're talking about here comes down to legal interpretation. So we can make our best go at it, but we need the approval of legal professionals before we actually roll out anything. So what does the European Accessibility Act actually say about content? Surprisingly little. It does have some of the fundamentals. So it says to work well with assistive technology. We'll talk more about what that is later. Having a flexible dynamic layout, alternative renditions of content, synchronized text for audio and video. That's mostly captions. DRM not blocking assistive technologies from working. The presence of accessibility metadata. And there is a broad inference of the WCAG. We'll go into what all of this means a bit more, but a lot of the requirements of the EAA come from this last point, from the inference of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So, what is it? The WCAG is a widely adopted set of standards for digital content. It was written primarily for web content, and it is maintained by the W3, who are the main standards body for the World Wide Web itself. The EAA is widely interpreted as broadly requiring adherence to WCAG version 2.2 level AA. This is based on a few different signals, so the connection between the two of them. First of all, the text of the EAA makes references to these 4 principles: perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust. These are the core principles of WCAG. So its reference directly to that is a clear read through. Additionally, the EAA's older sister document, which is the EU Web Accessibility Directive, covers accessibility for public sector websites and mandates WCAG 2.1 AA. Being brand new legislation, we're going to assume that the EAA is inferring the latest version, which is 2.2. That difference between 2.1 and 2.2 is important, particularly if you're in educational publishing, where there's interactive content, because a lot of the changes from 2.1 to 2.2 affect interaction. So these 4 principles we just mentioned, what actually are they? We have POUR, POUR, very easy to remember: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'm going to talk about each of those briefly, just so we're clear what they are, but just as a headline. P is for perceivable, so content can be perceived in different ways. Operable is about interacting with content and customizing it. Understandable, this is making content readable and predictable and helping users to avoid mistakes. And robust, which is broadly speaking, making sure the content doesn't fall over. We'll go into each of those a little bit more. So P for perceivable. What does this mean for content? Well, everyone needs to be able to perceive it, to take it in. This would include things like image descriptions or alt text, video descriptions, which often get called audio description, somewhat confusingly, closed captions, and then other stuff like just a flexible dynamic layout and accessible design choices that we'll talk a bit about later. The aim is to create content that can be adapted to a wide variety of needs and preferences. Just to zoom in on image description, pun not intended, images that convey important information need to be described, but images that are purely decorative should not. And I know there's another talk in this series about image description, so we won't go into huge detail here, but just to say most images requiring a description only need short descriptions of their salient features. Detailed images like diagrams might require longer descriptions, and the exact technical method for long description has not been rigidly defined. There isn't a full consensus yet, but that is a wider topic. There are also AI-assisted methods of generating image descriptions. I'm sure you have all had those marketed to you by this point. They are available, but approach them with caution, and I'll talk a bit more about that caution later on. Video description, as I mentioned, this is often known as audio description. This is a second track for those who can't see the video to describe visuals. So just to clear up that terminology, we've got closed captions, which are machine readable text for those who can't rely on hearing. Subtitles, which are burned into the screen, they're not accessible at all. That's just for foreign languages and things. And then video descriptions, which is machine readable text to describe what's happening visually for people who can't rely on seeing. The key design requirements, again, go beyond my scope here, but just to give you a few of the top ones, color contrast is the one everyone always talks about. So text needs to be sufficiently contrasting from its background. Don't rely solely on visual cues to convey information. Think about experience of readers with low vision, color blindness, or using assistive tech. Legible fonts and a clear and consistent structure. It's helpful for everybody to have consistency in structure to be able to quickly pass a page. And that has a different impact when it comes to assistive technologies. We'll get closer now to the assistive tech itself. Let's look at operable. So everyone can interact with and customize content to suit their needs. A lot of this requirement is down to the platform, but the platforms need well-formed content to do it. So well-structured navigation, proper level headings, a table of contents, making sure everything can be navigated with a keyboard, proper media controls, accessible animations in interactives, and zooming and resize options, the really fundamental stuff about how somebody can operate and customize the screen. Now, assistive technologies are mentioned a lot in this presentation. I just wanted to give you a few short examples. So on the screen here, I've got examples of a Daisy reader, which is a tactile device for navigating and listening to audio content. We've got an eye tracker, which is the Tobii Dynavox here, and a braille display, which if you've never seen one, is incredibly cool. The pins raise and lower themselves dynamically to render text or to render braille. Screen readers are also assistive technology, and you may have seen before an NVDA, JAWS, Windows Narrator, VoiceOver on macOS, and on your iPhone, you've probably switched it on by accident before, and TalkBack on Android. So these are all different technologies to help people navigate as well as consume published content. U for understandable. This is about reducing confusion, and a lot of this is going to apply to the reading system. But again, consistent formatting, trying to make content understandable and clear, but this is a bit vague how it applies to books. The one thing you can do is language declarations. It's making sure that in the code, you declare where something is in a foreign language so that the right voice can be used to read it out. And then consistent behavior and assistance with inputs for forms. Again, this is more for the reading system or the platform than it is for people making the books. And finally, robust. So we want a reliable user experience. Anybody who's used assistive technology will understand this one well. You're avoiding focus traps, which is where sometimes using a screen reader, you can get stuck in a certain bit and not be able to get out, often because something has visually changed on the screen and you've not been made aware. Or indeed crashing. You can only tell when you test, but some things will crash assistive technologies. This is also just making sure the content is simple and coded to standard so that it will correctly render on every potential platform. When we're talking about inputs and content, we should talk about format a little bit. ePub is the most accessible format. It's designed to be accessible from the start. That was always in its DNA. It's web-based, so of course it maps well to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, to WCAG. Supports really rich semantics, it's highly structured, and there are strong indications that it's accepted by the European Commission. I won't go into that now, other than to say there are conversations going on, and it looks very strongly like this will be considered a standard format. Only the reflowable type of ePub can fully satisfy the European Accessibility Act. But there may be some allowable exceptions. You may have seen some of the exceptions to the European Accessibility Act. There are three main exceptions. Those are disproportionate burden, fundamental alteration of content, and a micro enterprise. Again, it is outside of the scope of this talk to go into those too much now. And of course, PDF. PDF is designed for visual consumption only. There are accessibility optimizations you can make, but it will never be as accessible as a well-formed ePub. There are things you can do to improve it. If you look into the PDF UA standard and the wizard built into Acrobat Pro, you can make things an awful lot better for people. Most of these slides focus on ePub, but some of the rules do apply to both. PDF may or may not be considered to be compliant with the European Accessibility Act. We don't really know. And you may find you need to rely on exemptions in order for it to count. Again, we're not going to go too deep into code here, but just briefly to talk about the requirements on a top level. So structure, things need to be what they are. Headings and tables, etc., need to be real, not just fudged with formatting. We want a page list to map to print. Everything needs to have a correct, defined logical order. Semantics and tagging, which are vital for accessibility. So labeling the purpose of everything with semantic HTML, ePub type and ARIA roles. And as I've said before, language tagging. So you don't get weird things like an English voice reading a French word. And the other point is accessibility metadata. There are two parts of the European Accessibility Act that mention metadata. I won't talk about it much here because we're focused on content, but those are around discoverability and the place where the products and services are sold. So this means that the data needs to be available before download as well as after. And the two main types of accessibility metadata are ePub accessibility 1.1, which goes inside the ePub, and ONIX Codeless 196, which is a companion file outside. Finally, we'll just quickly talk about working with vendors. A lot of people will end up working with vendors in order to make accessibility happen, just because there's a lot to do and not a long time to do it in. What are some good general principles around working with vendors? Well, there are lots of new market entrants, so I'd say the first thing is be really cautious. Create spec documents to hold those suppliers to, and make sure they don't charge you if they've gone outside of that spec and have to remediate back to it. Build contracts around quality, which is analogous to legal risk a lot in this context if you don't do things well. Check costs for image description carefully. You don't want to be charged for them describing decorative images that never needed description in the first place, or redundant image descriptions where it was described in the text elsewhere. Be careful with AI-based solutions. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Obviously, you'll want to consider separate approaches for backlist remediation versus front. I know a lot of you are wondering about the backlist question. Won't be able to go into that today. Needless to say, you may want an approach that prioritizes front list. And ensure that they have capacity for varying demand levels. You will find, as with most publishing schedules, they're not fully consistent, and you need suppliers that can flex up and down. There are two broad types of vendors. You've got full service vendors who will handle everything for you, from typesetting to ebook creation, metadata. These will be integrated into the process. The reduced delay might be cheaper, but they're not necessarily accessibility specialists. And you can feel locked in, especially when it comes to renegotiating contracts with them. And of course, we have some specialists in this space. They'll often have a higher knowledge and focus, very high quality, and they can help you to sort of separate accessibility costs from everything else, which can be useful for budgeting. And you retain your agility to switch. But it's a separate process. The files need to be reintegrated after this work is done, and it can be more expensive. Finally, AI, which everyone asks about now. And yes, if you're struggling with alt text at scale, then you can use one of many, many services out there offering to assist that with AI. But bear in mind, a lot of vendors are rushing those to market because it increases the services they can offer and the volumes they can handle, not because it does anything for you. So be very wary of their quality, be wary of IP issues. Who owns this AI? How is it learning? Is it using things it learns from your content for other people's? AI is not good at understanding context, and this is really going to be the main problem with using it for image descriptions. The meaning of an image, how you would describe it, is contextual. It's very sensitive to where that image is and how it's being used. Often in books, there's a complicated socio-cultural and political context to the work itself and to how the image works within it. And of course, how far you've gotten into the book will also affect how you might describe an image. All of this is difficult for AIs to do. This is something they may get better at in time, but at the moment, you can often end up with very generic and sometimes quite hilarious image descriptions from them. That was a whistle-stop tour through content, so I'm going to leave it there. We will have questions at the end, and I've also given a QR code on screen now if anybody wants to ask me anything outside of this. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Simon. It was indeed a whistle-stop tour. Because of our time constraints, we were saying earlier, weren't we, that you know, you could have a session that could go on for days and days.
Yes.
Discussing
Sorry for
content.
the speed.
So just a few comments from me, really. I was quite alarmed by the 18 months in prison.
Yes.
Observation there for Ireland. For non-compliance, so that's quite sobering.
Yes. Remains to be seen if it happens, but it's there.
Yes, yeah. But you wouldn't want to find out the hard way, I guess, would
well,
you?
Yeah, you don't want to be the test case, and there is a real need for test cases in this stuff because we're guessing with a lot of interpretation, but you don't want to be it.
No, absolutely not. And what you were saying as well about content adaptability being key as well. Interesting to note as well, and I don't know if people may already be aware of this, and perhaps they're not, but it was good that you highlighted as well that the importance of making sure that your video content, if you have any, is also accessible, and it's not primarily, you're not solely concerned with just images and text. I say just in inverted commas, obviously. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that as well.
Absolutely.
And the importance of the spec when or if you're dealing with third parties. So yeah, thank you for highlighting all of that. So if I may ask you to give me the screen back, that would be great. And I will just, while you're doing that, I will just introduce James. So thank you, Simon. We'll have time for questions at the end. But we're going to hear from James Janczak now to get a publisher's hands-on experience with regards to accessibility, in particular with regards to the EAA. And James is Production Technologies Manager at Taylor & Francis, as I said earlier. And it's going to give us the background today on accessibility as it relates to his organisation. So how TNF's approach to meeting the requirements of the EAA has identified key areas of responsibility that were assigned to different teams internally, and how they tackled the EAA content requirements when it came to their backlist, their front list, and the impact of all of this on their distribution partners. So I'm just waiting for the slide to come back to me. Let me just check if you can see can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Let's just bear with me. There we go. How's that?
Yes. Well, it's Simon's, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so over to you, James.
Welcome, everyone. I will start with some background on accessibility at Taylor & Francis. In June 2019, we formed our internal accessibility working group to oversee the accessibility issues across the company. When the group learned of the EAA and realized it aligned with our purpose, we committed to supporting it and its June 28, 2025 deadline. This was a massive goal. We publish across a wide range of subject areas from philosophy to medical texts. Each area has its own publishing and accessibility needs. With decades of published titles in our backlist, we suspected the accessibility of them would be severely limited. We started with a huge volume, no budget to speak of, gaps in our knowledge, and unknown costs. Despite these obstacles, we set our priorities and moved forward. Our accessibility working group met regularly. Representatives were from every part of the company and each focused on their business area. Marketing handled hundreds of websites. Legal looked at the EAA, contracts, and emerging legislation. Sales queried customers and their expectations. Editorial looked at author responsibilities and the submission process. Content handled metadata and inventory, and my team focused on the actual ebook creation. My team took a deep dive into the standards of the time, ePub 3.2 and WCAG 2.1. This revealed our internal ebook specifications were woefully out of date, so we rewrote them to set a common target for vendors and our internal staff. At the same time, we increased our attendance in industry groups, especially those focused on accessibility. This provided us a vast amount of knowledge on the general accessibility landscape and identified issues we had missed and provided us solutions. These two steps showed we had to change our entire ebook evaluation system. Previously, it was no more than a visual pass-through of the files. First, we added ePub check on all titles, and then Daisy Ace in a manual inspection on a random set of titles. The results revealed knowledge issues and accessibility shortfalls amongst all of our vendors. We entered a period of checks and vendor education, but without positive results. We shifted our focus and developed an internal automated checking system to report mechanical errors in the ePub file. We shared this system with our vendors and eventually made it an automatic check for all files before they were accepted for publication. While much of what my team did focused on front list, it created the foundation to check the backlist of roughly 170,000 titles. As my team worked on specifications and the evaluation process, our content team conducted multiple inventories of our archives to ensure the files matched our business system records. Cross-checking found inconsistencies and some missing files. These were corrected and rebuilt as needed. From the inventory, we identified roughly 65,000 ePub2 files, all of which needed remediation. While my team built our evaluation system, the content team planned budgets using vendor quotes based on ePub samples and our newly published ebook specifications. Evaluation of quotes took time, but allowed us to plan out an upgrade process and stagger delivery in order to produce a steady stream of corrected files. Even with the staggered approach, vendors had to bring on extra staff and train them up over months to handle our new specifications. Vendors performed the conversion several different ways, but all the material was checked by their internal quality teams before being validated by our newly created ePub checking system. My team did spot checks on the files, and issues were reported, corrected, and added to our review system to prevent future occurrences. The sheer volume of the project exposed issues our evaluations had not discovered. We prioritized titles requiring the least amount of work in order to speed delivery and to limit costs. This required constant communication to identify and resolve specific issues like missing MathML, tables as images, missing files, scanned text, and inconsistent document tagging. By the end of the process, almost 30% of the files would require a complete manual rebuild, since the change from ePub2 to ePub3 could not easily be bridged. This forced us to delay work on those titles until the following year. Our content team was already well versed in redistributing corrected content. Correcting 50,000 titles and resending them was easy for our business systems, but less so for our distribution partners. Our content team carefully coordinated with the downstream partners to limit title delivery to avoid overwhelming their systems. Batches delivered around 3,000 files a month. In a few cases, distributors refused to use the new files, citing impact on customer experience. We encouraged them to replace the outdated files, but eventually it is up to them to do so, and not all have. The content team also maintains and delivers title metadata to the supply chain via ONIX updates. In 2021, the team explored ONIX accessibility metadata. Until this point, the accessibility details we collected were sparse and manually entered. The review showed we fell short in the accessibility reporting. Worse still, our business systems could not even store the data, even if we had it. Our automated checking system generated details about the submitted files, so we extended it to identify key accessibility metadata. A year-long effort was undertaken to update our business systems, while the content team mapped the accessibility metadata gained from the ePubs to relevant ONIX fields. It wasn't a complete fix, but it improved our reporting, and we continue to evolve the system. The metadata distribution proved as problematic as the file distribution. Most downstream vendors could not handle the sudden update of nearly 170,000 records. So careful coordination was needed to ensure the batches were agreed upon and sent. Enough of how Taylor and Francis got here. Before we move on to testing, we have to explore what we are testing against. This leads us to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. The current version is 2.2, and while the primary focus is web-based content, the digital nature of eBooks, and specifically ePub files, has given this recommendation a dual purpose. WCAG is the declared testing standard in both of the major accessibility legislative works, the European Accessibility Act and the Americans with Disability Act. When talking about WCAG, you will hear the acronym POUR used, as noted earlier. These are the main concepts of the standard, and we'll repeat them here just so they have significance. They are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable has 29 testing criterion and focuses on how well a person can consume or perceive the content. This covers areas like the use of color, closed captioning, audio, alternative text, and document structure. Operable has 28 testing criterion and focuses on how well a user can interact with the content. This covers areas like controls for video and audio, good document structure for navigation, keyboard focus, and obstacles or hazards which impede use. Understandable has 17 criterion and focuses on how well the reading system uses and interprets the content. This covers areas like document focus, text completion, identification of content components using languages or abbreviations. Robust has 3 criterion and focuses on identifying components to the reading system to assist the user with content use or interaction. This covers areas like field labels, identifying system messages, and semantic identification of content. So what does all this mean? The 77 criterion condensed down to just a few simple concepts. Book structure. The outline of books is accomplished with visual cues. Here you can see a chapter title, an author, some text, and a heading. Unfortunately, the visual aspect in many ebooks looks correct, but has a flat structure underneath all the text. Demonstrated here, each paragraph is no different from each other outside of some use of bold or italic. Good book structure requires proper tagging. Here our tags identify the header block of the chapter, allow the chapter title to be easily identified. We have nested sections which contain the appropriate heading level and the relevant text. Attributes are included to enhance the semantic meanings of the tags where appropriate. This structured approach will cover about 70% of your accessibility needs. Tag with purpose. Tag all content based on its purpose, not its appearance. This means you need to understand the HTML standard and use the tags defined there. This example shows a list. It was incorrectly tagged as consecutive paragraphs. The proper tags build an ordered list so software can interpret the results. Some tags need reinforcement, specifically when foreign languages are used. Here, italic indicates an undefined significance for this word, but adding language attributes identify it as a Swedish phrase, allowing systems to read it properly. Describe non-text items. Non-text items like videos, audio, interface items, and images need meaningful descriptions, not generic terms or duplicates of captions. Screen reading software announces the alt text. The generic term figure shown here tells the reader nothing. The good alt text at least describes the image, so it provides context for the caption and the surrounding text. And test. The WCAG criterion are the testing key you need to follow. Never assume your vendor or your software has done the job properly. Go through and test your content. Speaking of testing, this is a constantly evolving area. As accessibility standards are clarified, reading system developers create new features, and customer preferences are better realized. Participation in industry groups is key to remaining current in this area. Since ePubs are the focus of accessibility efforts at Taylor & Francis, they receive the most testing scrutiny. Our first step is ePub Check 5.1.0. This reveals critical issues within the ePub. There's a command line version ideally suited for automated workflows. There is also a user interface version called Pagina, which is used for testing teams which need to quickly check a small number of files. Our system uses the command line version and issues an automatic rejection to the vendor along with the error log when it fails. Since we initiated this check, our right first time rate has climbed over 99% for this step. Early on, we realized that testing a standard is the only way to ensure that it is followed. To support this, we developed an internal system for mechanical checks on our ePub files. This reported things like missing alt text which was duplicated the caption, commonly mistagged content, and incorrect semantic allocations. When we launched it, the right first time rate was 3%. When we made this an automatic check, the right first time rate climbed to 50%. More importantly, vendors can self-test and quickly remediate issues, allowing us to only publish files which fully pass this check. Our editors check proofs in the ePub reading system with ePub software, just like they would check a print product. We learned early on you must use a modern ePub reader, since many readers out there are no longer under development and many do not support even basic HTML features. The out-of-date or insufficient reading software provides results incompatible with the ePub standard or accessibility. Ideally, checks should involve multiple reading systems, and about 10% of our editors use a second reader in their testing. During your checks, use any read aloud functionality. Check the visual presentation, change the font size, change the pagination settings to ensure the text remains legible. Our editors do these basic checks and then check links and look for other items which were problematic during the production process. When we used an outdated ePub reader, our right first time rate was around 60%. Since we changed to a modern reader, it is now 95%. ACE by DAISY checks conformance with accessibility. It does not check everything, but it is a good starting point and reveals many issues. There's a command line version and a user interface version as well. We currently use the user interface version as part of our technical review and to quickly review alt text in an ePub. When we first started checking, the right first time rate for ACE was only 2%. Since we made ACE testing mandatory, the right first time rate has risen to 65%. Again, this allows our vendors to remediate until they reach 100% for the final submission. Manual code checks, a final part of our technical review. These are spot checks looking at the HTML code. This requires a reviewer who is familiar with the ePub, HTML, and CSS standards. This involves going through chapters, ensuring the correct tagging has been applied to the content. The most common failures we find are incorrect structural tagging, like using emphasis or italic, when some other tag like cite should be used. Missing language attribution for phrases on text, bad or missing semantic identification for quoted material or sources, or table headers. When we first started these checks, the right first time rate was 1%. After years of education and, more importantly, testing, our vendors have grown this to nearly 50%. Obviously, more training and more testing are required as we strive to raise this further. Our testing of PDF files start with a very basic pre-flight. This ensures all fonts are embedded, no thin lines exist, the color space is RGB, the trim box is consistent across pages. This is an automatic process, and the file is submitted when the file is submitted to Taylor and Francis. Failures are again immediately reported back to the vendor along with the report. After that submission, we proceed with a visual check. The editor verifies the bookmarks and the hyperlinks are set to the correct destinations, that alt text is present, and that the basic metadata is present. Since this is similar to the print proof checks, the right first time rate is 99%. A random selection of PDFs are then checked using Acrobat DC Professional and its accessibility tool. This reveals issues with document structure and reading order. Unfortunately, the right first time rate is much lower, running about 15% at the moment. That is a nice quick overview of how Taylor and Francis handles checking our files, and look forward to your questions later.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James, for that. I've just put your final slides up on the screen now, just for some resources and some tools that people might be interested in. But we no, but you don't need to grab a pen and scribble them down. We will be sharing the slides later on. So thank you for that. But yeah, and thank you as well for your sharing all that information, particularly the process you went through and your honesty with regards to, and your openness with regards to the sheer mountain of work that was involved, and your right first time rates as well. So I think that's hopefully encouraging for our attendees today, listening to your experience. Could I just ask you, with regards to the 170,000 backlist titles, roughly how long did that all take to have them checked, remediated, and then redistributed?
That is, the initial project lasted just over 3 years.
Oh, crikey. Okay.
Yes.
So.
That was not necessarily any limitation on the vendor's part. It was a combination of certain steps we had to go through, and we had to make sure our specifications were understood and constantly enhance our testing and evaluation methods to ensure what we were targeting is what was actually needed.
Yeah. and finding your way, I guess, as well was a large part of that. In light
Yes.
of the EAA. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very much. I mean, when we initially started and did our deep dive into the specs, we realized, we had not paid attention, and we were very much flat-footed.
Yeah.
Only the fantastic work by the other teams in the company were we able to actually get moving quickly.
Yeah. I guess that's the importance of, internal communications, isn't it? And collaboration with your internal teams and different areas of the business. And also, I think what comes out very clearly from your presentation is the absolute importance of testing. Always test, always check. Something that you mentioned that sort of struck with me was never assume, in the nicest possible way, never assume that your third party has done everything as per your request. And I don't mean that in a negative way, although it does sound a bit negative. But it's your responsibility at the end of the day, isn't it? So it's check, test.
And that is exactly it. It is our responsibility at the end of the day. And we help our vendors when we identify issues. We help train them. We help get them back up to the speed they need to be at. So this is a very much collaborative approach.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to, I have some questions, but I think I'll keep those to the end, if I may. So thank you very much, James, for your presentation today. I'm now going to hand over to Paul Porter to take the virtual stage. Paul is the Technology Officer at RNIB and is going to talk to us today about the impact and importance of ensuring all content is made accessible. So this is the sort of the real day, the sort of the impact on the users. We're gonna hear about that. We'll hear about his reading journey, the RNIB library as well, and the impact of the EAA and technological advancements. And we'll learn why accessibility should not be an afterthought. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Karina, and you've kindly we'll move on my slides as we go through the presentation. So I'm Paul Porter, Digital Transformation Manager at RNIB. I've got no sight, so forgive me if I'm not quite focused in the camera. I've got a braille display here that Simon mentioned earlier. I don't know if you can see it, but essentially I've got my presentation on here, but I'm reading with one hand and holding the phone in the other. So if you don't mind, I'm now going to turn my camera off so I can focus on the presentation, and it'll be great to take any questions later on in the session. Okay, so I work at RNIB, but I'm also an avid reader. Some of what I'm going to say is my sort of personal opinion. And I think really the bottom line is that I've called the session access to books for blind and partially sighted readers, but this can apply to anyone with a print disability. And RNIB does provide books to anyone who has a print disability, not just blind and partially sighted readers. I mean, personally, and and I think everyone would agree, access to books should just be, it should just be there. You shouldn't need legislation to make it possible. That there shouldn't be minimum requirements. Books should just be accessible from the get-go. But I understand, and we've had a fantastic presentation from Simon and James about the intricacies of doing that and the difficulties of doing that, particularly going through back catalogues and so on. But I would hope that going forward with the EAA, books are going to be accessible as they're brought to market. So my role as digital transformation manager is really to promote technology for our RNIB's customers to access our library content, which includes audiobooks, Braille, and we have a newsagent service for newspapers and magazines, and I'll talk about how those are accessible a little bit later on. I've been with RNIB 30 years, 2 weeks ago, and when I joined RNIB, there was a little bit of technology around. We didn't have the internet. We're still using DOS with a screen reader and a Braille display. Pretty much the only thing is I used my computer for was access to email and to write documents using Google WordPerfect. So we've come a heck of a long way in the last 30 years. It's almost like science fiction if you look at what we've got access to now than what we had access to even 10 years ago. Technology has improved my access to books in ways that I just couldn't have imagined, as I say, even 10 years ago. So, sorry, Karina, I think I've probably jumped a slide. So, if we can go on to human narration. So RNIB, until sort of 1990s, if you talked about talking books or audiobooks, RNIB was synonymous with producing those books through a number of readers. Most of them were professional narrators. And we could only produce maybe, I don't know, several hundred books a year because it was time consuming and expensive to produce audiobooks. Then in the 90s, audio books became big business with companies like Audible. And for me, that was a great opportunity to access many more books than I was getting from RNIB. RNIB produce talking books still, but we get a lot of books from publishers, and some of them give us their back catalogues. Some publishers give us their books for free, and some of them we pay for. We produce books on CD for our customers or a USB stick, and we also have a download service where customers can go on and find a book and download it onto their smartphone, tablet, or computer, or indeed Braille device. There are, as Simon mentioned, different devices for playing audiobooks. There are specialist CD players called Daisy players, or you can play our USB sticks on MP3 players. And we also have Dolphin Easy Reader for downloading books, either on your computer, smartphone, tablet, etc. So a customer can go on and find a book straight away. We also have our RNIB Bookshare platform, which the main focus is on eBooks and PDF books. And last year we reached a milestone where we've got over 1 million books that eligible users can access. And to use RNIB Bookshare, your educational institution has to sign up. And then as a student of that institution, you can access RNIB Bookshare and download books onto your device of choice. So in a flash, I suppose you could say, we've got access to hundreds of thousands of audiobooks, and if appropriate, and you're eligible, over 1 million books that you can access on your device. So we have various, sorry, onto the next slide, reading formats. I mentioned audio human narration. Currently, we've got over 46,000 titles available to either download or to request through our reading services team on CD or USB sticks. We have our Braille on Demand library, where customers can request books that are printed out on demand, rather than storing Braille books in a huge warehouse, which was the case up until about 3 years ago. And if anyone's ever seen a Braille book, you'll know that it's a massive tome, and each book is made up of usually more than one volume. So, for example, at school I read Lord of the Rings, which was in 20 volumes. We had an equivalent of a pocket dictionary, which would have been a paperback, that was in 16 volumes. We now have our Braille on demand. We have our Braille download service, and we have an SD card that currently has 7,000 titles on it. And a colleague worked out that if you were to print all those out in hard copy Braille, it would be the equivalent of about 6,000 tons of paper. And of course, you would need a huge area to store them. So again, much more choice. We also have our RNIB talking book Alexa skill, and this is for people who want to access books on their smart speaker. They can search for a book, find the book by title or author, and then listen to that book on their smart speaker. So we've got lots of ways of accessing books, and a lot of our customers are elderly and still prefer the traditional human narrated audio. But technology gives us a great opportunity to look at producing more books in audio. So, for example, using AI to generate very good high quality speech, where we could take ePubs or PDF books and convert them into a format that our customers can use. If customers want to read ePub or PDF on their devices, they can download and do that straight away. But I'm looking at this really from a human point of view, and my journey is one that I think many of our customers will relate to. So, growing up in the 1970s, I had access to RNB talking books, which was great, but the talking books came on an 8-track cartridge. If anyone remembers those, the player was a player you plugged into the mains, and you had to sort of linearly go through the tracks. It was very difficult to move chapter by chapter or page by page. You just really had to listen to the book from beginning to end. And around about year 2000, RNIB introduced DAISY, which was essentially books recorded onto CD, and one CD, because the audio was in the MP3 format, could hold up to about 24 hours of audio. But as Simon and James mentioned earlier, it's important that you're able to navigate through a book and not just read it in a linear fashion from beginning to end. So you might want to jump chapter by chapter, page by page, section by section, or even sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, if required. The DAISY format allows us to do that with our audiobooks, and it's been hugely popular over the last almost 25 years, I guess. So really, up until the DAISY system was introduced, RNIB was still producing audiobooks, and gradually we started working with publishers who very generously gave us their books and their back catalogue and so on to make available to our customers. In 2014, we introduced our first download service where customers could go onto RNIB Overdrive and find and download books onto their computer or smartphones, tablets, etc. In 2020, just as COVID hit, we introduced the next iteration of our download service called RNIB Reading Services, where customers could again find and download audiobooks or braille books onto their device of choice. And I think when we launched RNIB Reading Services, I think at the time we had about 25,000 titles. But working with publishers, we've now got, as I say, over 46,000 titles. And we have a bit of a backlog to prepare because of the generosity of our publishers who have given us their back catalogues. We're finding that customers are now finding that the books that they want are available at the same time as they're made available generally. So just as an example, Spare by Prince Harry came out the same week we had it available to download or to have on CD or audio, and as a braille format as well. Going back to the 70s, I would often wish for a book to become available. 9 times out of 10, it wouldn't be available because it was expensive and difficult to produce books in audio or CD. Sorry, audio or braille. But now I'm able to get access to books that everyone else has. And there's nothing more delightful than, for example, the latest Booker winner, or I'm an avid Radio 4 listener, so listening to Front Row, I might hear of a book, being discussed and think, oh, I want to read that. And chances are it is going to be available to me from RNIB or from other sources. And there's nothing more enjoyable and feeling it. I really can't express just how wonderful it is to be able to get a book and read it at the same time as everyone else is reading that book. Or indeed, on the contrary, you might get a book and think, oh, I don't really like that. So you can not read a book. Whereas when you're starved of books, and I've only really got over this recently, I would tend to read a book to the end because I thought, this book has been produced for me and I should read it. But I've now got to the stage that, like everyone else, I can pick up a book and think, no, that's not for me, and move on to the next one. So that really is just a brief run through of my experience as a blind reader. I would hope that books are made accessible as they're produced, and that backlogs of books will be made accessible too. I actually used AI to produce these slides, so any feedback would be welcome. And I think AI is going to be hugely important so that we can make more books available to our readers. A lot of our readers still prefer human audio, but if we can use AI to produce human sounding high quality voices, then we can take books that are available in, I don't know, PDF or ePub and make them available as audio. Increasingly, our readers will be using technology to access the ePub and PDF books directly. And just as a final thought, when I was studying at university and started in 1982, I had van loads of Braille turning up. I also had human colleagues, fellow students, reading books onto cassette for me. And one chap I remember was very good, but he read every punctuation mark, full stop, comma, etc., which really didn't help in my understanding of the book. But now, with accessible books, I can pretty much find a book that I want to read and have it read to me in audio, read it in Braille, navigate through the book, read it, even word by word if I want to check the spelling of a word. So we've come a long way in terms of accessibility, but we've got a long way to go. And I think, it is great that we've got the legislation, but I really would hope that publishers aren't going to just do the bare minimum to make books accessible, because there's nothing more dispiriting than finding a book that you want to read, but then it not being accessible. And it's happening less and less for me, but it's still a problem. And I really just want to be able to read in the same way as everyone else. There should be no barriers in terms of accessibility or having to wait a long time till the book's produced. It really fills me with joy just to be able to pick up a book at the same time as everyone else and read it. And that should be a right for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a fantastic insight to what all of this means to you as a consumer of hopefully increasingly accessible content. I think the thing that came out the most for me there, and hopefully everybody else as well, was that you said you just want accessible books, you want the same access to books that everyone else has, and that you just want to be able to read in the same way as everybody else.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
yeah, I mean, that's very powerful. And I think as well, we shouldn't underestimate, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, obviously, but we shouldn't underestimate the impact, the social, emotional and psychological impact of not being able to read the same books that maybe your friends or your colleagues or your family are reading, and that having improved access to the books that your friends, colleagues, family, etc. are reading can only be a good thing.
I mean, just as a very quick example of that, it used to take RNIB a number of months to produce a book in audio. But in 2007, when the last Harry Potter book was released, it was actually available on the same day on audio CD in DAISY format as it was in print. So my stepdaughter and I both got our same books at the same time, and that was the first time that happened. And, and that was, it was revolutionary. It was like, again, I'm reading the same book that she was reading at the same time, and it is very powerful.
Yeah, it is. It's vitally important. And I think maybe that, again, I don't want to put words into anybody's mouths or suggest things unfairly, but I think maybe, does that sometimes get the sort of just the human impact. I think we do well to remind ourselves of that, if not, well, hopefully all the time. So thank you for sharing your experiences there today. Would you say that there is a particular type of book or genre of book that is harder to access just by nature of the way the content is laid out, or the type of content itself?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose something that's very graphical, pictorial, whatever, is difficult to make accessible. But with image recognition and so on, then I suppose that's going to be easier.
Yeah, but it sounds like from the 70s to now, there's been a huge step change, huge improvements. Still not quite there yet, but what would you say the biggest for you? What would, if you had to sort of call out one thing, what would you say the biggest difference between then and now is?
I think it's really you know, it's almost like if a new book's, you know, if a book comes out, you kind of think, yeah, I should be able to get that now, you know, be it the latest Richard Osman book, which is very popular with our readers, or you know, something a bit more. I was testing a bookshare platform, and I've got an interest in railways, and you know, I just happened to find a book on the development of Chinese railways in the 20th century. You know, the production of high speed lines at a high speed rate. You know, and that was accessible and readable, and you know, the sky's the limit in terms of subjects that I might want to read and get access to.
Yeah. And do you, I should probably save this for the Q&A session. I just wanted to ask you a question about finding available content, but I'll save it for the Q&A. So thank you very much again for sharing your experiences and for giving us an insight into you know, how things have changed over the last I don't want to say how many decades.
50 odd years, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I am now going to move us on to our Q&A session. So now's the time. So we do have some questions coming in, so I'll have a quick read of those in a minute. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is and I've not done this before, so do bear with me if it goes horribly wrong. We have a poll. It's just one question, and will it work? It's just one question, and it's just to get an idea of how you view your organization's EAA readiness. So we're not going to share the data. We're not going to. We'll look at it at BIC only. We're not going to publish it or anything like that. And all we'll see is the percentages of people that are responding. So that's it. So we see a few replies are coming in already. So thank you for looking at that. So so questions. Let's have a look and see. Okay. I don't know if we'll know. We may or may not know the answer to this within this group. And again, we're not lawyers, so do double check this with your legal teams or your legal representative. Does video accessibility include when a video is posted on YouTube, such as a book launch video? Who would like to answer that question?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Does video accessibility include when a video is posted on YouTube, such as a book launch video?
I mean, that depends on, yes, those videos should be made accessible, but if we're talking in terms of the European Accessibility Act, the question becomes, is that a part of the book? And in that case, it sounds like it's not. It's being linked from it, which makes it ancillary material, which is a big debate among accessibility professionals at the moment. Yeah. Whether that's considered in scope or not. Probably not, just because making sure everything you link to in a book is accessible is obviously an enormous standard to meet. It's a very difficult thing to do. But broadly speaking, if you are authoring those videos, you should be creating closed captions and audio description or video description to go with it, which you can feed into YouTube. So there's no reason not to, but whether it's strictly in scope is a tricky legal question.
Okay, fair enough. Next question is for James. So James, you indicated that editors manually check ebook files from the vendor. Are these the book editors or content ops specialists in ebooks that are the editors?
These are the editors which work on the production process. So they're usually, they'll oversee copy editing, layout, things like that. So they're not the commissioning editors.
Okay.
Does that answer? They're not specialists in eBooks or anything like that. So.
Okay. So would they have a sort of a checklist to
Yes.
compare against? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
we have a checklist of the items they need to go evaluate, much like I'd mentioned, change the text size, change the view dynamics and things like that, check the read aloud. And so they'll go through all those steps. And then, like I said, go and look at the areas where they may have had problems. If there was some particularly difficult layout item, they'll go and double check that it's rendering in an acceptable fashion. And if not, they go back through the process and discuss it with the vendor and figure out a solution.
Okay, thank you. Question for Paul. Will the RNIB Bookshare platform support fixed layout ePub books in the future? As a children's publisher, we have highly visual books that are in this format, and it means they can't currently be provided.
Sorry, which format?
Fixed layout ePub.
Okay, so I'm really coming at this as a kind of user and promoter of technology. I don't know the specification. I mean, we do have experts who can answer that question, but
Okay.
I couldn't answer that at the moment.
All right, thank you. Let me just see if there are any more. Getting a few thank yous. So many thanks to the speakers for sharing their insights and experiences. I've heard some academic publishers state that while they consider the Act to apply to eBooks platforms, they perceive academic journal/stroke serial content to be out of scope. Do the panelists have any insights?
I think that's probably a good one for James.
Yeah, and this sorry, just to say, this person also states, I agree that we should be aiming for accessibility regardless of being forced into it by legislation, exclamation mark. So I think that's nice to hear. So James.
Yes, and that's exactly the attitude that should be undertaken. We should be trying, publishers are the presenters of knowledge. You can't hold back the knowledge from a select few people because you don't feel like doing it. That's entirely the wrong attitude to take. Our journal's covered. Again, not a lawyer. We do not believe so. Does that mean we're going to not develop? By no means. One thing to also consider is the EAA will evolve. More items going to be brought into it on a much shorter time scale. So it's best to start working on this now. As you saw with us, it took us years to get where we're at.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you. And kind of on a similar but slightly different note, looking at smaller publishers that might have, a very, very small team, maybe, maybe less than 10, maybe less than 5. What would your advice, so this, I guess, is to all the panel, what would your advice be to them when they are, I guess, already sort of maxed out in terms of workloads, etc.? What would your sort of, I don't know, one or three tips be for how to sort of tackle this? Because I imagine there may be some organizations that are, quite small, that are perhaps feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what is needed to be done.
Yeah, I can speak to this one. First of all, it depends how small, because there is a micro enterprise exemption for the European Accessibility Act.
Yeah.
And again, spirit of the law, not word. So you should be looking to be compliant wherever possible. But it is possible to, if you're very small, to make an exemption there. If you look at the European Accessibility Act, you'll see how that's calculated. There's also a disproportionate burden, which again, it has to be argued per title and renewed every 5 years, but that is possible. with that aside, if you're going to try and tackle it, obviously you'll be working with vendors. Being a small publisher isn't necessarily a disadvantage in this space. If you talk to the big publishers, they'll say it's especially hard for us because we've got massive catalogs. So they would think of being a smaller publisher with a smaller catalog as an advantage because you've got less to fix. Obviously, it's complicated because you've often lower resource, but resource per published title is different, and often that's not especially different for a smaller to a larger publisher. Everyone's trying to be as efficient as possible. So it really depends on the publisher themselves, on their specific circumstances. But I'd say engaging good quality vendors, contracts built around quality, as I said before, and using a lot of specifications. If you put your effort into specs and then hold suppliers to those specs, that's an awful lot safer than simply comparing them on price or whatever else. You want to go a lot further than that, because if they tell you they're technically compliant, you could find that actually what they were producing wasn't, and you end up in court.
And can I add on, for the small publishers, you're stretched. Very well understand that. That's how I got into this industry. Following good typesetting practices, using tags for headings, tags which define a list, tags which define a paragraph or define a quote. Simple things like that build the foundation to allow you to more easily port over into accessible content. That, as I had said earlier, is 70% of the battle if you have a good structured document, even in a typesetting program. So knowing how to do that is key. And that's a good starting point.
Oh.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I would just agree with James, just build it in from scratch, and once it's done, it's done. It's best practice, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question, sort of again, building on that, is standards and best practices change and evolve over time. First of all, what's your experience of keeping abreast of those? And then secondly, how might publishers manage updating and checking for compliance against their the titles that they've already converted to be accessible? How do you see the standard evolving and the industry maintaining its records and its files to keep compliance with the new standards?
Was that to anyone in particular?
Anyone who wants to take it.
Sure. I mean, first of all, accessibility standards, we shouldn't see them as something that's constantly changing. Actually, the core ingredients to accessible publishing are not going anywhere. There will be small changes to keep abreast of as the WCAG evolves, but broadly speaking, the core tenets that we've talked about today, you can rely on those being around forever. And they can't go a huge amount deeper just because it stumbles upon what's possible for publishers to produce. So I wouldn't worry too much about that to begin with. There are industry groups you can join, including the PAAG. That's a really good way of keeping track of how this stuff evolves over time. If you're in those spaces and you're in LinkedIn, you will hear about it inevitably. And no doubt BIC will run events that will help to make you aware as well. This is all part of being in this space and keeping abreast of things, but I wouldn't worry about constant change. It's not really a thing here. That also being prepared for future formats. Well, accessible files, actually, as James was just hinting, they are intrinsically more transformable. They're easier to turn into other things. They are more semantically rich. So you're already in a better position by doing it now. For even if it's not to do with accessibility, the next ePub format, you'll be in a much better position with accessible files.
Okay.
And I'd like
James,
to echo that is, industry groups, BIC, Page, good starting points, because the information will filter through those groups to the members from experts who are paying attention to this all the time. So I dedicate several hours a month to other industry groups and other groups to maintain our knowledge of where is it heading. And Simon's very correct. The poor is the core, to use a fun rhyme.
Love it.
That's not changing. There may be small little specific, oh, well, if you do it this way, just add this. Those are little fine nitpicky details. Will they break accessibility? No. They may enhance accessibility, but they're not necessarily going to break it. Those will change over time. We do a yearly review and update our ebook specifications every year, because we know there is a gradual drift, and we also identify other issues we've overlooked previously. So it is an ongoing process, but it's not that onerous.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a question for Paul. Let me just put it out. Bear with me. So hi, Paul. Thank you for your presentation. What have your experiences been with cookbooks in particular? Have you any examples of some that have been created really well with accessibility in mind? So do you cook? Maybe you don't cook. I don't know.
I do, but I very rarely. Yeah, I'm not a great one for recipe books, but you know, again, can't give examples, but you know, you want, of course, to be able to find a recipe or even browse. So you know, you might want to, you know, for example, just go from. You would have different levels. You would have, say, different sections. In fact, I do have an example. It's an Audio Daisy example, but my wife uses it. It's I think it's one of Delia Smith's ancient books, you know, and that's been produced so that you've got each section you can navigate, and then within that section you can navigate from recipe to recipe. And you can do that on a Daisy player that James mentioned. My wife uses a small portable Daisy player, so you would download the book from our NIB reading services, copy it onto an SD card, and play it on the player. If you've got an ePub or PDF book, then of course using an appropriate device, smartphone, computer, etc., you would be able to type in a name of a phrase or a, I don't know, type in potato, for example, and jump to it directly. But even with audio, it is possible to get navigation down to a very fine granular level. And just as an example of that, we've got the RNIB produce a weekly Daisy record production of of TV listings. And if you were to listen to that from beginning to end, it would be about 18 hours. So in a linear format, of course, that wouldn't be any good. But with Daisy, you can you would have, for example, the top level would be the days of the week. Then the second level would be the individual channels, and then you might have morning, afternoon, and evening. So with maybe 3 or 4 keystrokes, you could find out, what Coronation Street was about on Wednesday evening at 7:30. So navigation is key, and the ability to navigate at very fine levels, for reference books, for TV guides, and for recipe books, is really important, because you don't want to just listen to, an hour of recording to get to the bit you want. You want to be able to jump to that very quickly.
Yeah. Just like somebody would do in the print book, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've got one. We're going to go slightly over. So are you okay the speakers, you're okay for just a couple of minutes? I've got one question, and then I think we'll need to end the Q&A session, unfortunately. I wanted to ask Paul, in terms of discoverability, how easy is it for you currently to go onto a website or a platform and search for books that or content or authors or topics that you're interested in, and establish that it is created with accessibility in mind?
Yeah.
Or is it guesswork for you at the moment?
I mean, I tend to either read Braille titles that I download electronic Braille or
Right.
audio titles. But a good example of that, I guess, would be Amazon Kindle books, where when Kindle was first developed, books weren't accessible, so there was hundreds of thousands of titles that just weren't accessible. And then overnight, Amazon flicked a switch and made a lot of their books accessible, but they have to have an accessibility flag. So, it is a case of going through and checking that.
Yeah.
But even reading things like manuals for equipment, or something you might have bought from a from a shop or online, can be very difficult to. It might be a PDF document, but it's just an image, so there's no text. So there are still lots of pitfalls, and I think, Simon, you mentioned books that, or documents where you're stuck on a page and you can't navigate out of that. And that happens to me on occasions. And technology is improving with the ability to recognize images in screen readers and so on. But wouldn't it be wonderful if everything was just accessible without having to go through hoops to make it so?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably a good point to leave this conversation on. I think that's a perfect sentence to end our event on today. So just before we end, for those that are curious, that want to know the poll results, and it's the first time we've done this poll, so forgive any technical errors. I'm aware that some of you just saw the poll screen for probably a bit longer than you wanted to see it, so thank you for your patience there. So 43% would prefer not to say, or they don't know, which is perfectly understandable. 13% said they will be completely ready, which is impressive. 33% said their front list will be ready, work on the back list will continue, and 10% said we have an accessibility plan, but we may not be 100% ready by the deadline. So yeah, that was interesting results there. So thank you to those of you who completed the poll, and thank you for your honesty. That's really good feedback. So before we go, I would just like to say a massive thank you to our three speakers today, on behalf of everyone, on behalf of me, on behalf of BIC, and also everyone in attendance. So thank you to Simon, James, and Paul for taking the time out of your diaries to prepare and also present to us today, and for sharing your expertise and experiences. We'll make the presentation slides for today's session available on our website shortly. This will probably be next week. And a recording of the whole webinar will be sent to you all again probably by next week. You might get it sooner, but don't panic if you haven't. It will also be posted onto our YouTube channel in about a month's time, give or take. And if you've signed up for our mailing list, you will already we'll let you know when that is actually happening. You'll notice when you log out, you'll get a survey, just a quick survey. It's one question, just to say what types of topics would you like this series of accessibility webinars to cover in the future. We've reminded you of the topics that we're already planning on covering. So if there's anything you think we've missed, do please let us know, and we'll try to accommodate that. And then finally, to our attendees, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today and for sticking with us. I know we've run over slightly. I hope you found it informative. Please do stay in touch. You can find out more about what BIC does via our website, as per usual, and you can stay up to date with everything that we're doing in terms of events, projects, meetings, committees, announcements, all of that good stuff, by joining our mailing list. So it just remains for me to say thank you once again, and hope to see you at a BIC event in the future. So take care until then. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.